So, most Latin Christian readers of the Middle Ages considered the Qur'an as a puzzling piece of work. They raised many questions surrounding its meaning or its place in the broader plan that was set by God for the history of the world. Following this, the question of its origins seems at minimum mysterious. As the traditional Islamic explanation of a miraculous revelation of the Qur'an could not be acknowledged by a Latin Christian audience, these readers had to come up with their own propositions. Dominican writers who were among the best versed in the knowledge of the Qur'an and in medieval Christendom also tried to explain this success with their Muslim contemporaries. This communication is focused on the elaborate narrative reported by Friar William of Tripoli, who lived and worked in the Dominican convent of Acre in the 13th century. We do not know much more about his life. His works tend to show that he learned Arabic to some extent, and his Quranic quotes often deviate from the extant Latin translations of the Quran, which might indicate that some of these quotes could be original or even taken from unknown translations. This shouldn't be too surprising, as the majority of the sources that he uses are obscure to us. I will nonetheless try to elaborate on that point regarding what inspired his narrative about the beginnings of Islam. William of Tripoli produced his works hoping for the imminent end of Islam as he predicted in his writings. His optimism regarding the supposed forthcoming mass conversions of Muslims to Christianity, as Thomas Berman wrote, is directly linked to his positive views towards their religion. Regarding this, we could also go back to the important work of Robert Burns about what he called a dream of conversion that was expressed by several writers of the 13th century. This perspective partly explains why William of Tripoli's work diverged from those produced, for example, by Ricolda Monticroci after the fall of Acre. This communication is mainly focused on the Notizia de Macometo, William's first and perhaps only work, as the paternity of his second work, the De Statu Saracenarum, is still disputed. I will, however, mention the De Statu when necessary, as it shows some complementary details reinforcing the ideas of the first work. While going through the sources, we should keep in mind the exceptional nature of these texts, as we'll see how William of Tripoli develops his unique narrative. The author announces multiple goals in the introduction of the Notizia. Firstly, to clarify who Muhammad and the Saracens are, where they come from, and how their sect could spread so vividly and powerfully. Secondly, how Muhammad's book of law, called Qur'an or Furqan in Arabic, was written and who was its author, compilator, or inventor. Thirdly, to identify the teachings of this book and how it relates to the Christian faith. After reading this, our main objective will revolve around the ways that William of Tripoli's exceptional views of Islam shaped his narrative about the origins of the Quran. The first part of this communication is about the relationship between Muhammad, his companions, and the hermit monk named Bahira, as it is told by William of Tripoli to propose an explanation for the composition of the Quran, followed by his criticism of the traditional Islamic dogma. As a follow-up to that part, I will also add some details about his take on the origin of some Quranic precepts, especially on the prohibition of alcohol and pork meat. The last part will revolve around William of Tripoli's attempt to define the Quran more or less as a corrupt patchwork of biblical stories and principles mixed with false dogmas. Let us now try to navigate through Friar William's narrative on the origin of the Quran, starting with the life of Muhammad. I will focus on the importance of each character afterwards. It might sound surprising that the first chapter of the Notizia de Macometo does not mention Muhammad at all. William sets the stage around Bahira, a monk living in Egypt, where the caravans from Arabia usually crossed the desert. While the Notizia does not give much information about Bahira, the De Statu Saracenarum ambiguously defines him as a Christian man of religion, simple but with an austere lifestyle, which could indicate a naive yet sincere personality. One day he spots an orphan, the young Muhammad, and decides to educate him by teaching him the most basic religious knowledge, that there is only one God to know, to fear, and to love as the creator of heaven and earth, and that one should show faith, love, and do honor to Jesus Christ and to his mother, the Virgin Mary. William of Tripoli whose goal was in part to show how close the two religions are, uses these common dogmas between Islam and Christianity in order to demonstrate how similar they are, even at the cost of overlooking their greatest oppositions, such as their positions regarding Christology. In the following years, Muhammad's power grows stronger, and he eventually becomes the ruler of his people. Dozens of followers join his party, and soon they start to revere him as a prophet and messenger of God. Let us take note here that William of Tripoli does not give any other explanation for this sudden change in Muhammad's status. The story continues as many idolaters, Christians and Jews, join Muhammad's troop. The Prophet commands the idolaters to worship only one God, the Christians to honor Christ, and the Jews to turn to God. He also commands all of them to acknowledge him as the messenger of God and his prophet, so that they all agree to say the following: there is only one God, and Muhammad is his messenger. This introduction to the Shahada shows Muhammad both as a warlord and a spiritual figure, but above all as a unifying leader for every religious sect in Arabia. The exact function of the Islamic creed isn't explained until later in the text, where William of Tripoli gives a different Latin translation as well as a transliteration of the oath in Arabic. This example gives us a glimpse of the author's linguistic knowledge, although it isn't clear why he would give two different translations of the same sentence. Coming back to our story, Bahira continues to provide his teachings to Muhammad, who seems sincerely interested with his religious study. His companions, however, do not consider the influence of the monk favorably. Their enmity towards the hermit evolves to the point that they decide to get rid of him. One night, while Muhammad is neutralized by his drunkenness, they go find the monk and beat him to death. After this murder, William of Tripoli insists even more on the malevolent aspect of the companions. As on the next morning, when Muhammad asks about the identity of the perpetrators of the crime, they tell him that he's the one who killed Bahira in his drunken rage. We'll get back to this episode a bit later. So, without the guidance of his mentor, Muhammad goes back to waging war and successfully brings more territory to his rule. These conquests go on until the death of the Prophet of Islam. William of Tripoli does not give much information about the circumstances of his passing, as the Notizia only dates it while Muhammad is planning to attack Alexandria and the Destatus Saracenerum locates it in the city of Mecca. So, now that the companions are the only ones in control of such a great empire, they wonder how they can maintain this situation. They see, as the author tells, that Jews and Christians both have their own law, which they identify with the Bible, and soon realize that Muslims could also have their own divine law. The task of composing such work falls upon Uthman ibn Affan, the only one of the companions who was literate according to William of Tripoli. He gathers many testimonies about Muhammad, as well as a team of new converts who were previously Christians and Jews, as they were well versed in religious questions, and he asks them to establish the text of the Qur'an. William of Tripoli says that these new Saracens, although sincere in their task, could not find any deed or word from Muhammad showing some wisdom, foresight, or virtue that was worthy of praise or proved his integrity. Because of that, they only praised him without explicitly mentioning his name. Except in one Quranic sentence, Muhammad is only the messenger of God. Let those who believe in him fear, for if he died or was killed, and that someone turned back on his faith, his iniquity would not affect God. Friar William insists afterwards on the Quranic emphasis on Moses and Christ, both praised several times with utmost reverence. Regarding this passage, we should keep in mind the initial aim of the Notizia, which was to show how the Quran relates to the Christian faith. The author makes the case that Muhammad is certainly not the most crucial figure in the Holy Book of Islam, and that his importance is somewhat eclipsed by the virtues and honors of Moses and Christ. We also have mostly covered the passages related to the first two main objectives of the Notizia de Macometo, which were to clarify who Muhammad and the Saracens are and to explain how the Quran had been produced. After these developments about the origins of the Quran, the Notizia de Macometo as well as the Destatus Saracenerum report about the traditional Islamic narrative of the miraculous revelation of the Quran. However, I would like to address the opinion of the author about this explanation in the Destatus Saracenerum. Saracen professors tell that when Muhammad was 45, he started to say that he was a prophet of God, as the angel Gabriel had brought him the divine will and as he indicated and taught him what his listeners compiled afterwards to produce this book, the Quran. They cannot prove that it is true. This final conclusion helps us to understand what the author of the Destatu thought about the traditional narrative of the revelation of the Quran. He presents it not as a lie told by Muhammad, but as a tool used by Saracen professors or magistri to legitimize the Quran. Let us remember that no explanation was provided by William of Tripoli about the fact that Muhammad was revered as a messenger of God by his followers, and that he presents the Quran as a work produced under the direction of the companions after the death of the Prophet. In this narrative, the role of Muhammad is reduced to the biographical elements that I presented earlier, and his implication in the Quranic enterprise seems at least negligible. So, to sum up the main characters of this narrative, we've got, in order of appearance, Bahira, Muhammad, and his companions. Bahira is the Christian figure in the story. He teaches Muhammad everything that is related to Christianity. And Friar William presents their link as a mentor-apprentice relationship. On the religious aspect, Muhammad appears to be the most neutral character in this story, as William of Tripoli does not give many details about his personal beliefs. He's mostly presented as a warlord and as a unifying leader for the Arab people in spite of their religious diversity. Finally, there are the companions, mostly presented as a group unless one of them stands out for a particular task, such as Uthman ibn Affan for the production of the Quran. In the story, this group is hostile to Bahira to the point of murdering him, which might symbolically indicate their antagonism towards Christianity and its influence on Muhammad. William of Tripoli shows the companions as the main actors of the production of the Quran, deciding to produce it in order to maintain the unity of the Arab people as well as the power that was earned through the conquests of Muhammad. The task of writing the Quran falls upon new converts, previously Jews and Christians, as William of Tripoli mentions, because of their knowledge in religious matters and because of their literacy skills. This account and its overall narrative appear even more curious, as it's not used at all in the works of contemporary Dominicans. Ramon Martí, who worked before William of Tripoli, does not mention Bahira or even discusses the origins of the Quran in itself in any of his works. The life of Muhammad is also told in details in Ramon Martí's De Setama Cometi, but this work focuses on the demonstration that Muhammad was a false prophet. Friar Ramon uses several episodes of Muhammad's life that highly differ from William's narrative. Then Riccoldo da Monticroci, who came to the Near East a few years after William's passing, tells an entirely different story. His narrative does not focus on the supposed circumstances surrounding the origin of the Quran, but rather on the spiritual significance of the rise of Islam and on the definition of the Quran as a tool used by the devil to deceive man. While William of Tripoli's Muhammad looks like a spiritual warlord, Riccoldo da Monticroci depicts him as a mere pawn in the complex schemes of the devil. The importance of Bahira is also significantly reduced in his Liber Peregrinationis, where he is only described as a Christian heretic, a Jacobite with an unknown influence on the Prophet of Islam. His Contra Legem Seracenerum gives a similar depiction of the monk and even reports that Muhammad might have been his murderer. In both Ramon Martí's and Riccoldo da Monticroci's works, the companions of Muhammad are simply described as the first followers and eventually successors of Muhammad without many other details. As these authors diverge quite significantly in their narratives, we can understand how the many elements surrounding Muhammad could be used differently among Dominicans, depending on the intentions of the writers, the context in which they wrote, and their access to various sources. While keeping in mind the different contexts in which these writers produced their works, all these previous elements about the origins of the Quran lead us to think that William of Tripoli used sources that didn't necessarily match with his confreres. His emphasis on Bahira could at least partly be explained by his contacts with Oriental Christians throughout his life, as he lived in the Near East. These Christians had been in contact with Islam for centuries and had developed their own narrative about its origins. They knew about the Islamic traditional accounts surrounding Bahira and they acknowledged his existence, but obviously didn't share the conclusions of the Muslims. Several Oriental Christian sources give us rich testimonies about the legend of Bahira. The subject was masterfully covered by Barbara Rahama in her work the legend of Sergius Bahira, Eastern Christian Apologetics, and Apocalyptic in Response to Islam. She makes the case that William of Tripoli's narrative about the origins of Islam, especially dealing with Muhammad's youth, are deeply inspired by local Christian stories. We could furthermore argue that William of Tripoli could have had some sort of contact with these sources, maybe through translations that are known to us, or even by discussing with Oriental Christians. Learning about Bahira with the help of such sources might have led William of Tripoli to the major differences between his narrative and his confreres. The introduction of a Christian monk as the mentor of Muhammad in the Notizia might also be driven by William's intention to show the ties between Islam and Christianity. The question of the origin of certain Quranic laws is also a good element to show that William of Tripoli used sources that his confreres were unaware of, or if they were, didn't write about. Let us now get back to the episode of Bahira's murder. We saw that William of Tripoli portrays the companions as especially pernicious, as they lie to Muhammad and accuse him of the murder of his own mentor. The Dominican writer tells that it was this event that led the Prophet of Islam to forbid alcohol. It is because of this that Muhammad, outraged not against his own drunkenness, but against wine, that with his prophetic authority, he excommunicated those who trade, gather, carry, sell, or drink wine, as well as those who store wine in their house. The author immediately adds a short notice about the prohibition to eat pork, and this is why pious Saracens do not drink wine nor eat pork, as someday a pig entered a shrine that they had built and polluted it. These anecdotes underline the ridiculous aspects of the laws prohibiting alcohol and pork meat. We can also find this topic of the ridiculousness of Islamic laws in the works of William's Dominican confreres. Although Ramon Martí discusses Quranic laws extensively in his works, especially in the De Seta Macometi, he doesn't refer to the same prohibition, but rather prefers to denounce matrimonial and sexual behaviors, defining them as immoral, unnatural, and sometimes ridiculous. We should, however, keep in mind that Ramon Martí's intention isn't precisely to criticize Quranic laws, but rather to ridicule Muhammad in order to attack his prophetic legitimacy. Riccardo Monticroci, who was a reader of Ramon Martí, uses similar examples to criticize Quranic laws. But he takes different examples about the origin of the prohibition of alcohol and pork meat. The Italian writer relates in his Contra Legem Seracenerum the legend of Harut and Marut, two angels who drank wine before engaging in sexual intercourse with a woman. This narrative is better known among Christian polemicists than William of Tripoli's explanation about the murder of Bahira. Riccardo Monticroci writes that he read about this story in a work called the Liber Narrationum. The editor of the Contra Legem Seracenerum, Emilio Panella, mentions that this source is in fact the Doctrina Mahomet, translated by Herman of Carinthia in the 12th century. That was somewhat contradicted by Arthur Chimkovich in his paper about the legend of Harut and Marut, where he claims that Riccardo Monticroci's journey to the Middle East gave him access to other sources. This intuition is supported by Jean-Marie Mérigout in his edition of the Contra Legem Seracenerum, where he notices that Riccardo's writing of the name Bahira suggests an influence that is Syriac rather than Arabic. Even though we don't know much about these hypothetical sources, we cannot deny that Riccardo da Monticroci did study at least some Oriental works during his stay in Baghdad, the first one obviously being the Qur'an. This example of a narrative probably inspired by Oriental sources could be similar to William of Tripoli's case that we explored earlier. Following this, examining the question of the definition of the Qur'an shows once again that William of Tripoli was studying the subject on a level that differs from his confreres. The first element that he mentions about the Qur'an is that it presents the biblical story in a superficial way, running and dancing around when dealing with the story, only mentioning a few episodes of the Old and New Testament, twisting their logic and omitting most of their content, etc. These considerations could be related to the common opinion about Islam among Latin Christian polemicists, but they're also somewhat mitigated by the numerous Quranic quotes reported by William of Tripoli. One of the chapters of the Notizia di Macometo mentions no less than 19 passages discussing the Virgin Mary, Jesus Christ, and Christians in general. Although we won't have time to look through them, I will however mention that they are quoted without any commentary, and that they do not openly contradict the biblical text, although they don't always perfectly align with it. William even mentions that when talking about divine authorities, the Quran contains such pious and reverent words that it encourages faith and devotion up to tears. This passage of the Notizia clearly revolves around the third aim that William of Tripoli presented at the beginning, which was to show how the Quran relates to the Christian faith. It also reveals how ambivalent his positions towards the Holy Book of Islam was. But even with so many similarities between the biblical and Quranic texts, their differences must be denounced. While dealing with the Quranic passages telling an Islamic version of the stories of Christ and the prophets of the Old Testament, Friar William writes, "This book, the Quran, as it appears to those who know about the sacred scriptures, is some sort of compilation made from many stories taken from the other divine books, their words of ideas and ideas of truth having been modified. This book is nothing but the corruption of the faith and morals of the previous books." We can see how this conclusion can be linked with the beginning of this narrative. William of Tripoli presents the situation as if the teachings of the Christian figure Bahira had been corrupted after her companions gradually took control of the political and religious situation. Firstly, after Bahira's murder, and secondly, after the death of Muhammad. This accusation of falsification of biblical stories also addresses and counters the Islamic accusation claiming that the Jews and Christians modified the Bible. Other Christian polemicists denounce differences between the Quran and the Bible. This is especially the case with Riccardo da Montecroce, who proposes in his Contra Legem Saracenorum that the devil himself, while inspiring the Quran to Muhammad, corrupted the biblical text on purpose to capitalize on the success of the Christian faith instead of creating a whole new story. So I would like to conclude with some comments, starting with the uniqueness of William of Tripoli's narrative among Latin writers. As I said earlier, not only his story is not used by his confreres, but we also saw how such elaborate narrative were not produced by another Dominican friar of this era. Another singular aspect of this author is that he probably relied on local Oriental Christian sources to write such original propositions about the origins of the Quran, which could partly explain why they do not match with Ramon Marti's or Riccardo da Montecroce's. We also noticed that he even gave different origins to the different origins of the prohibitions of pork and alcohol, although denouncing such Islamic rules is a common leitmotif for Latin polemicists. Regarding Bahira and Muhammad's companions, it is clear that they were known among these writers. Yet such explanations about their presumed role in the production of the Quran are way less common. I hope that this brief overview of William of Tripoli's narrative contributed to shed light onto the creativity surrounding his accounts on the origins of the Quran as produced by a Dominican friar who lived in contact with Muslims as well as Oriental Christian populations in the Levant in the 13th century. Thank you very much.